I'm Patricia Langley, retired Army Colonel mother, and for years the invisible woman in my own family. My son once told me to stay out of the way, said I was just a clerk who didn't understand how business works. But at his company gala, his CEO stood up, looked me in the eye and said, "Colonel Langley, ma'am." This is the story of how I stayed silent, stood tall and reminded everyone, especially my son, exactly who I've always been. If you've ever been quietly cast aside, this one's for you. I hadn't worn heels in years, not since the last military ball before I retired. My toes protested with every step as I moved around the living room, testing out the only black pair I owned. Simple, worn, but polished. Just like me. The invitation had arrived the week before, a thick ivory envelope with gold-foiled lettering and Ethan's company logo embossed on the back. I recognized his assistant's neat print right away. 5-year Founders Gala. Business formal. Open bar. Media presence. I flipped the card over, and there it was, in smaller print, beneath the RSVP line dress appropriately. Media present. Subtle. Efficient. Cutting in its own way. Ethan had always been precise with his words. Or maybe not precise, but careful. When he wanted to tell me something without telling me, he let someone else do it, like Lauren, his wife, or his assistant, or the silence between his "Hi, Mom" and "I'm running late." I set the card down on the kitchen counter beside my mug of tea. Chamomile, my second cup that morning. The invitation sat like a guest I hadn't asked for, quietly commanding attention. I walked to the window and looked out at my small garden, the one I'd planted after I retired from the Army. Tomatoes, green beans, basil, and a row of perennials that kept coming back no matter how harsh the winter. I liked that about them. They returned, even after the ground forgot them. It had been years since I attended anything of Ethan's. Not because I wasn't invited, though truthfully sometimes I wasn't, but because I'd learned not to push myself where I wasn't wanted. There was always a reason, a scheduling mix-up, a smaller guest list, or just, "Mom, it's not really your thing." But this time the invitation had come, formal, on paper, with a guest list, a dress code, and a table number. Still, the line about dressing appropriately sat like gravel in my chest. Ethan used to sit on the edge of my cot when I was home between deployments, asking me what it was like out there. He was curious, wide-eyed, only 8 years old. I used to tell him about the base dogs, the way mail arrived in burlap sacks, how the cooks tried to make cake from powdered eggs. I never told him about the time we had to do triage during a sandstorm, or how we patched up vehicles with leftover aircraft wire. Those stories weren't for children, but the ones I did tell, he'd hang on every word. Back then, he thought I was brave. Now, I'm not sure he thinks I'm much of anything. The shift happened gradually. By the time he hit college, he stopped asking. By the time I retired, he'd stopped listening. And when he started the company, well, I was proud, of course I was proud. But I noticed I'd gone from "my mom served in the Army" to, "yeah, my mom did admin work somewhere." Somewhere. What no one knew, because I'd never told them, was that I'd invested in his dream long before any venture capital firm believed in him. $79,412. That's what I gave him from my military savings. I never asked for credit. I never even asked for shares. I just wanted him to stand on something solid, something that didn't come with interest rates or strings attached. He said thank you once, on the phone, quickly like it was a check mark. I remember hanging up, looking down at the withdrawal slip from my retirement account and whispering to myself, "Well, that's what moms do." Now, 5 years later, I wasn't even listed in the company timeline on their website. His father, my late husband, was. Lauren's parents were. Even a college professor was thanked in one article. But I was nowhere, as if I'd never been part of the beginning. I walked back to the invitation and stared at it again. Media presence. I'd commanded field bases, managed high-pressure logistics in 4 countries, negotiated peacetime supply contracts in 2 languages, and helped evacuate over 200 personnel during a base fire in Kandahar. but apparently I needed reminding to dress appropriately. I picked up the card, carried it to my study, and set it beside a photo of Ethan on his 5th birthday. He was holding a toy tank I'd brought home from a training exercise in Texas. He had no idea it cost me 4 hours of paperwork and 1 heated conversation with customs. I sat down at my desk. There, tucked inside the bottom drawer, was a small velvet box containing my bronze star. Buying. I didn't display it. Not out of modesty, but because it never quite belonged on a wall full of wedding photos and baby pictures. It belonged to the woman I used to be. The one who lived out of duffel bags and made spreadsheets in desert tents. I opened the box and stared at the metal. I hadn't taken it out in years. The metal was still cold, still gleaming. Proof of things no one asked about anymore. Then, without fully deciding, I stood up and walked to my closet. The black dress I'd worn to my husband's memorial was still wrapped in plastic. Simple, sleeveless, appropriate. I laid it on the bed and began to iron. I didn't plan on making a scene. That's never been my way. But I would go. I would show up. Not to prove anything to them, but to remind myself that I still existed even if I'd been erased from the slideshow. After all, I was invited, and I always kept my commitments. The valet opened the door before I even had time to straighten my coat. I stepped out slowly, heels meeting the pavement with more certainty than I felt. The event hall was modern, sleek, all glass and steel and self-importance. I hadn't been in a place like this since the military retirement ceremony 3 years ago, where the speeches were half as flashy but twice as honest. I handed over my keys and walked toward the entrance. Inside, soft music spilled from hidden speakers. There was the unmistakable scent of expensive cologne, catered hors d'oeuvres, and polished ambition. A young woman in a headset approached me at the door. "Name, please, Patricia Langley." She tapped quickly on a tablet, then paused. "I don't seem to have you on the printed guest list," she said with a small apologetic smile. "Were you added late? I was invited directly," I said calmly. "I have the card if that helps." "No, that's all right. Let me just give you this." She peeled off a blank label and stuck it onto a lanyard. "Guest. No name, no title." She handed it to me with the practiced ease of someone who did this a dozen times a night. "Enjoy the gala." I slipped the lanyard over my head and moved forward. The ballroom glowed with soft amber lights and a flicker of LED screens displaying the company logo ELX Systems. 5 years of innovation. I spotted Ethan across the room before he saw me. He stood near the center table, flanked by men in tailored suits and women in velvet gowns. His posture was polished, shoulders back, chin high, the same stance he used when he was 12 and wanted to look taller. He laughed at something, tossed his head slightly, then turned and froze. His eyes landed on me, and for a moment his face went perfectly blank. No smile, no greeting, just a subtle tightening around the jaw. Then, as if remembering the world was watching, he composed himself and walked over. "Mom," he said, voice low, but forced into warmth. "I didn't think you were coming." "You sent an invitation." "I accepted," I answered, matching his tone. He looked around quickly, then back at me. "Right, of course. It's just, we weren't sure." Before I could reply, Lauren appeared perfectly poised in a navy blue sheath dress and earrings that probably cost more than my car. "Patricia," she said with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "You look lovely." "Thank you. I think the side tables might be more comfortable," she added gently. "Closer to the exit. Quieter. There's a lot of press around and it gets chaotic near the front." My fingers curled lightly around the clutch in my hand. "Of course," I said softly. "No fuss. No need to argue." Lauren turned to a passing staff member. "Could you show her to table 12? The young man nodded and gestured for me to follow. As I walked past Ethan, I caught a whiff of his cologne. Sharp, metallic, almost unfamiliar. He didn't meet my eye again. Table 12 was tucked behind a decorative column near the service doors. From my seat, I could see the kitchen entrance and half the dance floor, A screen nearby displayed looping highlights from the company's history: photos, interviews, office parties. I sat down slowly, smoothing the fabric of my dress. My nameless guest badge rested on my chest like a quiet disclaimer. A waiter passed by with champagne. I declined. The main table sparkled at the center of the room, elevated slightly set under its own canopy of lights. I saw Lauren's parents seated there, glowing with pride. On either side were Ethan's co-founders, a former professor he once idolized, and a tech influencer I vaguely recognized from television. There was no empty seat for me. No mention of me in the printed program either. I flipped through the sleek, glossy booklet handed out at the door. In the Foundations and Gratitude section, Ethan thanked investors, his mentors, his wife's support network, and even their dog. No mom. Not even a placeholder. Not even a mistake. I closed the booklet gently and set it aside. It didn't hurt the way it used to. Not like that first year he forgot my birthday, or when I found out from a third cousin that he'd gotten married without telling me. No, this was different. This was quieter. Like watching a door close slowly and knowing there's no reason to knock again. A few guests walked past and nodded politely, assuming I was someone's +1 or perhaps staff. I nodded back. I didn't belong to their world, not in their eyes, but I also didn't need to. Across the room, Ethan raised a glass, laughing at something. He looked radiant under the lights, successful, celebrated. He had no idea that half of that success stood in the shadows, watching silently, wearing a borrowed label. And that was fine. I hadn't come to be seen. I'd come because I was invited, because I still believed, even after all this, that some things mattered more than pride, because the truth doesn't vanish just because no one says it out loud. And one way or another, the truth always finds a way in, even into rooms where you've been gently told to stay out of the way. The music swelled around me like a conversation I wasn't part of. I could hear the clink of champagne flutes, laughter timed too perfectly, and the low hum of ambition being rewarded. Across the room, a photographer snapped photos of Ethan in front of a branded backdrop, one arm around Lauren, the other held out to some investor I didn't recognize. I sipped my water slowly. The chair I sat on wobbled slightly with each shift of weight. The linen tablecloth was too long bunched at my knees. From here I could see the catering staff moving in a steady rhythm. Plates out, plates in, refill, clear, reset. Their coordination reminded me of mess halls in the field, purposeful, silent, unseen. Funny how invisible people are the ones who keep things moving. I leaned back and let my mind drift, not out of boredom, but survival. There's only so long you can sit in a room where you don't exist before your thoughts start pulling you somewhere warmer. I thought of the night before my second deployment. Ethan had just turned 10. We'd gone to the park that afternoon, just the two of us, and he'd climbed to the top of the jungle gym yelling that he could see the whole world. I stood at the bottom, arms crossed, smiling up at him. I didn't tell him I was scared. I didn't tell him that every time I left I wondered if it was the last time I'd see his face in person. That night, I tucked him in. He didn't want to talk. He turned away when I kissed his forehead. "You're always leaving," he whispered. I told him I was coming back. He didn't answer. When I returned 8 months later, he was taller, quieter, and something in his eyes had shifted. 3 years later, when I missed his middle school play due to emergency deployment orders, he left a letter on my bed, folded in half, written in pencil on notebook paper. I still remember the smudges where his hand had dragged over certain words. It said, "I hope your job makes you happy because it sure didn't make me." I kept that letter. I never replied. What was there to say? That I was sorry. That he wasn't wrong. Because sometimes love demands a price it doesn't ask permission for. Years passed. Apologies never quite came. We danced around things instead. Birthdays celebrated over calls, holidays missed, milestones passed by. Then during his second year out of college, Ethan called out of the blue. He sounded excited, nervous. He said he had an idea, a business plan, Something about renewable systems and military-grade logistics for civilian application. He needed startup capital. Not much, he said, just enough to get off the ground. I remember where I was standing when he asked. In the hallway next to the dusty curio cabinet that still held my husband's flag and my first pair of boots. I was already retired by then. Living modestly, nothing fancy. But I had savings. I'd invested wisely over the years, skipped vacations, passed on new cars, and never bought the bigger house. I asked how much he needed. He said he was pitching $100,000, but if I could loan him $75,000, he could get moving faster, secure a space hire, a coder launch, a beta. He used the word loan, but we both knew I'd never ask him to pay it back. 3 days later, I sold stocks. I wired him $79,412. He texted, "Thanks, you're the best." That was it. No call, no follow-up, just a quick line before disappearing into business plans and caffeine-fueled nights. I didn't mind. Not then. I believed in him. I still do in ways I can't always explain. But what I didn't expect, what I couldn't have known, was how far he'd go to rewrite the story of his success without me in it. I watched him give interviews on local news stations, watched the company grow from 2 desks in a rented space to a multi-million-dollar operation. I listened to him thank professors' friends who stayed up all night coding, even an old coach for teaching him discipline. No mention of the woman who moved her entire life to ensure his didn't crumble before it began. No word of the person who sold her security so he could build his ambition. I wasn't asking for applause, just acknowledgement. But sometimes silence is louder than rejection. Because silence says, you don't exist in the parts I'm proud of. Back in the ballroom, I blinked slowly and brought myself back. The crowd erupted in light applause. Ethan was heading to the stage. A spotlight followed him as he took the microphone. He began with a joke about early failures. Servers crashing late nights, ramen dinners. People laughed in solidarity. He smiled polished and poised. Then he said, I want to thank the people who made all this possible. The ones who believed in me when this was just a crazy idea. My wife Lauren for standing beside me even when I was broke and stubborn. My co-founders. My professors at Belmont. And of course, my mentor Greg, who taught me everything I know about business ethics. I folded my hands in my lap. There it was again. The erasure, not malicious, not loud, but surgical. He wasn't angry at me. He simply didn't see me. He didn't remember the call, the wire, the sacrifice, or worse. He remembered and chose to leave it out. And still I didn't move, didn't cry, didn't flinch, because I had made peace with being a quiet foundation. But sometimes even the ground deserves to be seen. The applause for Ethan's speech still lingered faintly in the room, like the tail end of a storm that hadn't quite cleared. Conversations began to pick up again. Those polite, effervescent exchanges that make galas feel more like theater than celebration. I stayed in my seat at table 12, where the tablecloth hung too low, and the place cards had no names. My name tag, still blank except for the printed word, guest, rested lightly against the neckline of my dress. I reached for my glass of water and took a small sip, letting my eyes travel across the ballroom. The lighting had shifted, less stage, more spotlight. A looping video began to play on the large screen mounted above the platform. It was a professional cut-sharp transitions, branded fonts, soft, inspirational music building in waves. The story of ELX Systems. Ethan appeared on screen in his early 20s, hair longer, eyes brighter. The narrator spoke in a warm, authoritative tone. From humble beginnings to national contracts, ELX Systems has transformed the way we think about logistics. One bold idea at a time, photo after photo flashed across the screen. Ethan in a college dorm room surrounded by whiteboards filled with formulas. Ethan shaking hands with his first major client. Ethan cutting the ribbon on the company's first office space. Ethan and Lauren at their engagement party toasting with her family. Ethan and his team at a retreat in Napa. Ethan with his dog wearing a tiny vest with the ELX logo. My hands rested in my lap fingers interlaced. The smile on my face didn't flicker, but inside I felt the quiet hollow that comes when you realize something essential has been rewritten. And you weren't even asked for your edits. There wasn't a single image of me, not even one from the early days when I helped him build his business plan, or the time I reviewed his logistics pitch and flagged a calculation error that could have cost him his first grant. And certainly not the morning I wired him my savings without hesitation, without question. They'd told the story of Ethan's journey, but they'd cropped out the foundation. When the video ended, the crowd clapped again, eager, admiring. A few stood for a brief moment, raising glasses in unison before sitting back down as waiters moved quickly between tables. The next course was on its way. Smoked salmon roulade with microgreens, the kind of dish more about presentation than nourishment. I stood slowly. My knees had begun to stiffen from sitting too long. I didn't want to draw attention, and no one noticed me leave the table anyway. I walked toward the back of the room where the drink station was set up away from the stage and chatter. A young woman behind the bar gave me a gentle smile. "Water wine? Or sparkling?" "Just water," I replied. As she turned to pour, I heard footsteps coming from behind the curtain that separated the ballroom from the hallway. Ethan's voice carried, not loud but not soft enough to miss either. "She showed up after RSVP closed," he said clearly to one of the event staff. "Can we just keep her toward the far tables? I don't want her in press shots. She's not part of the ELX story. I mean, she's just a retired clerk." "You know?" He laughed lightly, like it was harmless, like I was a harmless misunderstanding he had to quietly manage. "She's sweet, but she doesn't exactly match the image we're going for." The words landed not like punches, but like needles. Precise, clean, and meant to leave no visible mark. My spine straightened instinctively. Not out of pride, not out of pain, but out of the muscle memory of someone who had once stood for inspections in desert heat, whose name had once been called over radios in crisis zones, not kitchens. Just a retired clerk. That's what I was now. Not Colonel Langley. Not a logistics commander who had rerouted supply chains mid-deployment with nothing but a whiteboard and a generator. Not the woman who carried body armor on her back and responsibility on her chest. No, I was just his mother. Someone to tuck away behind drapes and discreet smiles. I didn't move. I didn't flinch. I just waited until he walked back into the ballroom with his polished grin and practiced wave. Someone else had heard him, too. A server stood near the catering doors, a tray of empty glasses balanced on one hand. Young, maybe 25 at most, with the stiff collar and polite posture of someone working their way through school or supporting family. His eyes had darted toward me as soon as Ethan said those words. Not in judgment, in recognition. He looked down briefly, then up again, and I saw his gaze linger. Not on my face, but on the corner of my leather handbag. There, near the zipper, was the patch I'd sewn on years ago. A small rectangle of black fabric with gold stitching. It read, "Colonel Patricia Langley Rhett." I never wore it on my clothes. I never corrected people when they assumed I was just some mild-mannered administrator. But that patch, it was mine. A quiet truth I carried for myself. The server looked at it, then at me. His expression changed slightly. Not surprise exactly, something more like quiet understanding. And then he nodded once before disappearing behind the kitchen wall. I stood there for another moment, then lifted my water and walked back to my seat. No one looked up when I returned. No one asked where I'd gone. The world kept turning. The servers kept serving. The conversations picked up again. Startups, funding rounds, summer homes, travel plans. Ethan took another photo near the stage arm around Lauren, smiling so wide you'd think he had the perfect life. I sat down quietly and folded my hands in my lap again. A waiter came by with my plate. I thanked him softly. He paused just a beat longer than usual, not out of pity, not out of awkwardness, but like he knew something now, like I wasn't quite who they'd assumed. I looked across the room one more time. There was a time I would have gotten up and left right then. I would have gone to my car, driven back to my little house, and cried in the driveway where no one could see. I would have told myself that I shouldn't have come, that I was foolish to expect anything different. But not this time. This time, I stayed. I stayed because I had every right to be in that room. Because what I'd done wasn't erased just because it wasn't displayed. Because even if my son had chosen to forget, I remembered every moment I'd stood behind him when no one else did. And because sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is sit quietly where they didn't want you, and let your presence speak louder than their dismissal. They called me a clerk. They'd learned soon enough who I really was. The clinking of silverware and soft background music continued as if nothing had shifted, though something had. Not in the air, not yet, but in me. My bones felt more solid than they had when I walked in. The ache behind my ribs had settled into something sharper, clearer, like a truth that no longer needed to be softened. I looked down at my plate. A thin slice of salmon, a smear of green puree, 3 microgreens artfully arranged. Pretty tasteless food for people who wanted to be seen eating but not to be fed. I lifted my fork and tried one polite bite, but it stayed on my tongue too long. I set the utensil down and reached for my water again. That's when I saw the man. He had just entered through the side hallway. Tall, broad-shouldered, in an understated charcoal suit, not flashy but quietly commanding. His stride was smooth, like someone used to walking into rooms where he didn't need to introduce himself. I recognized him instantly, though I hadn't seen him in person for years. Jonathan Rice, CEO of Convergent Logistics, a man who had worked across military supply chain reform, known for bridging defense and civilian infrastructure. Ethan had mentioned his name once or twice, always with a mix of awe and apprehension. What was he doing here? He paused at the reception desk and spoke briefly to a staff member who pointed toward the main table where Ethan sat. Ethan noticed and stood smoothing the front of his jacket, clearly preparing to greet him. But Jonathan didn't walk toward Ethan. He walked toward me. Each step, slow, deliberate, not in confusion, not in error. Straight to table 12. I stood before I even realized I was doing it. "Colonel Langley?" he said, extending his hand, his voice carrying just enough to hush the nearby tables. "It's a privilege." I blinked, surprised, but only for a moment. Then I accepted his handshake. "Mr. Rice? Jonathan?" "Please." He smiled. "I wasn't sure it was really you until I saw that patch on your bag, and then it all clicked." I offered a small nod, saying nothing yet. "I came across your name again last month," he continued. "The Pacific Asset Optimization Report, your framework from 2012, we've been revisiting it in one of our new initiatives. Honestly, it's held up better than half the stuff we've paid consultants for." The corners of my mouth lifted just slightly. That was a long time ago. "Good work doesn't expire," he said. By now, the tables nearby had gone quiet. The servers paused mid-step, and at the center table I saw Ethan's face drained of color. Lauren froze wineglass halfway to her lips. "I didn't know you were connected to ELX," Jonathan said thoughtfully. "Ethan never mentioned, though I suppose modesty runs in the family." He glanced toward the main table, then back at me. "I'll be honest. I came here mostly out of courtesy. 5 years is a respectable milestone. But now I'm thinking it's serendipity." I tilted my head. "How so?" "We've been assembling a think tank," he said, "to guide the civilian adaptation of military-grade logistics models. We need someone who understands both sides, not theory, practice, command, pressure. You'd be perfect." I felt my heart beat once. Firm deep like a drum, signaling not pride, but clarity. "I'd be honored to talk," I said, my voice even. He smiled wider. "I'll have my office reach out." Then he turned slightly, projecting his voice just enough for others to hear. "You didn't tell me your mother was Colonel Langley?" he called out toward Ethan's table. I always assumed she was enlisted. A quiet type. Ethan opened his mouth. Nothing came out. Then finally she She doesn't talk much about all that. Jonathan raised a brow. Pity. Seems like exactly the kind of story a company like yours should be proud to tell. There it was, the pin dropping in a ballroom full of carpet and distraction. The moment they saw me, not because I made a scene, not because I demanded it, but because someone who mattered to them told them I mattered too. The spell of erasure cracked just like that. Jonathan gave my hand one final shake and with a nod turned to mingle elsewhere. Conversations resumed slowly, but I could feel the difference. The way people glanced at me now, the way Lauren leaned into Ethan whispering too quickly, the way even the servers walked by with more intention, more awareness. I didn't adjust my posture or my voice. I didn't wave, didn't gloat, didn't even smile too much. I just sat back down, folded my hands, and waited for the next course like nothing had changed. Because for me, nothing had. I had always been Colonel Langley. They were just catching up. The clatter of forks and glassware resumed slowly as if the room itself needed a moment to recalibrate. Music trickled in again, something jazzy and unmemorable. A waiter brought around dessert, a delicate square of something chocolate with a gold leaf on top. I didn't touch mine. Across the ballroom, the ripple Jonathan Rice caused had begun to settle, but not entirely. I noticed the way heads still turned, subtle, then quickly turned back. The way whispered questions floated between tablecloths and floral centerpieces. The way even the photographer, now circling again, gave me a second look he hadn't bothered with earlier. It was like watching people search their memories for details they never thought they'd need. Had she always sat at table 12? Did she always wear that patch on her bag? Was she important? I didn't need the answers. I'd known who I was when I arrived. Now they did too. I glanced toward the head table. Ethan was looking down at something in his lap. Probably his phone. Lauren was stiff beside him, her posture less elegant now, her smile forced. She leaned toward him and whispered something. He shook his head subtly but firmly. Whatever she said, he wasn't ready to deal with it. I didn't expect him to be. Recognition, after all, doesn't always bring reconciliation. Sometimes it just brings discomfort. Ethan had spent years building a version of me that was manageable, forgettable, one he could explain away. The mother who sent Christmas cards and baked casseroles when asked, not the one who led 100-person operations under blackout conditions, not the one who wrote logistical frameworks that outlasted administrations, not the one who knew what it meant to be obeyed. He had to keep me small. Until someone else made it clear I never had been. He still couldn't meet my eyes. That was fine. Eventually, he stood and made his way across the room. Slow, almost casual, like he was just doing the rounds. He passed one table, then another, smiling politely, saying something to a guest, nodding to a business partner. Then finally he reached me. "Hey," he said with that careful smile I knew so well. "Didn't realize you'd be doing some networking tonight." I looked up at him, my expression quiet, unreadable. "I came because I was invited." He shifted slightly, hands in his pockets. "Right. Of course, I just meant, well, Jonathan Rice, he's a big deal. So I've heard." He glanced down at my untouched dessert. "Not a fan of chocolate, I've had better," I said simply. A beat passed between us. Then another. He looked like he wanted to say something more. Maybe explain. Maybe joke. But nothing came. And I wasn't going to fill the silence for him. Eventually, he gave a quick nod and muttered, "I'll let you get back to it," before turning away. I didn't watch him go. I didn't need to. Instead, I stood and made my way toward the restroom, not because I needed a break, but because I wanted a moment alone. To breathe. To think. To be still in a place without linen and LED screens. As I passed near the hallway, I walked by a small group of women standing near the coat check. Lauren's friends, I assumed. One of them was holding a flute of champagne, the other looking at something on her phone. Their voices dropped as I neared, but not enough. "Wait," one of them whispered. "That's her. The mom I thought she was like a receptionist or something." "No," the other replied. "She's the colonel. That Colonel Langley, from the Pacific Operations thing." Their eyes met mine briefly. One of them straightened like she might say something polite. I kept walking. I didn't need their surprise. I didn't need their apologies either. What I had was enough the truth. When I reached the restroom, I stepped inside and looked at myself in the mirror. The lighting was warm, gentle. My hair was pulled back in a simple twist, my lipstick barely worn. I looked composed. But more than that, I looked real. Not a role, not a decoration. A woman who'd built things quietly. Who had walked through fire and come out clean. Not without scars, but without bitterness. I ran my hands under cold water and let them rest there for a moment, palms open, breathing slow. I remembered the field tents, the maps, the hours of rerouting convoys while sand battered the edges of our tarps. I remembered ration packs and nightly reports and the way my voice used to carry through satellite phones like it had weight. I hadn't lost her. That woman. She was here still, and tonight someone else had seen her too. When I returned to the ballroom, no one blocked my way. A waiter pulled out my chair. The photographer passed by and this time paused. "Would you like a photo, ma'am?" I thought for a moment, then nodded. "Just one." He snapped it without asking me to pose. Just me seated, hands gently crossed in my lap. Not smiling, not frowning, just present. I didn't wait for the applause to end. After Jonathan Rice stepped away and the air settled back into casual conversation, I knew my purpose in that room had run its course. I didn't want dessert. I didn't need another glass of water. I didn't crave a final word or acknowledgement. I stood, lifted my bag gently over my shoulder and walked toward the exit the same way I'd entered. Quiet, unnoticed. The doorman held the door with more intention this time. Maybe he'd heard the word colonel. Maybe not. But his nod carried something different than when I first arrived. Not awe, not pity. Just regard. The night air kissed my face as I stepped out onto the sidewalk. The hum of traffic, the warmth from street lamps, the faint click of my shoes against concrete. It all grounded me in the present. I wasn't angry. I wasn't shaken. I was simply clear. I drove home in silence, letting the city lights roll over my windshield like old memories. The quiet reminded me of late-night convoys. When the engine noise was steady, the radio chatter low, and you had nothing but your thoughts between checkpoints. When I got home, I didn't turn on the lights. I walked through the front door, slipped off my shoes, and sat in the kitchen. The tea kettle still sat on the back burner where I'd left it that morning. I filled it slowly, set it to heat, and leaned against the counter while it whistled. And then I walked down the hallway to the study. A small room lined with built-in shelves, a corkboard covered in maps, and a battered oak desk I'd kept since I was 27. The bottom drawer stuck a little. It always did. But I gave it a tug and pulled out a black accordion folder wrapped in an elastic band. Inside were documents I'd never intended to revisit. Yet here I was. I slid them out one by one. First, the old deployment ledger. Handwritten records I used to keep before everything went digital. Each bonus check. Each living allowance. The scribbled notes I'd made about how much I could send home without tipping off Ethan's father. How much I could save toward retirement. How much I could gift quietly. Then the trust documentation. The legal arrangement I made through my attorney in 2015, the year Ethan asked me for seed funding for his big idea. He'd called one afternoon while I was gardening. He spoke fast words, tumbling over themselves with urgency and hope. I'd never heard him sound so alive. "Mom, I've got something. I really do this time. I just need a bit of runway." I asked him how much. He hesitated, then admitted, "About 75,000, but I could make do with 50. He never asked if I had that kind of money. Just assumed, but that wasn't what stayed with me. It was what he didn't say. Thank you. Still, I'd said I'd help. And I did. I sold off a conservative portion of my retirement index funds, carefully, deliberately, and gave him $79,512 within a week. But not before I sat with my lawyer and put it in writing that I held 27% of the business through a blind trust in someone else's name. He never knew. I never wanted him to. It wasn't about ownership. It was about not being erased. And now, I was done. I read through the contract again slowly, eyes tracing each line. The trust had done its job. It allowed him to grow without my shadow looming. But tonight had reminded me my shadow had never even been visible to him, not when it mattered. I closed the folder gently and walked back to the kitchen where the kettle had long gone quiet. I poured the hot water over a bag of Earl Grey and sat at the table, the documents beside me. I reached for a notepad and pen. The first letter was to my attorney. Dear Linda, I am formally requesting the dissolution of my equity interest in ELX Systems held through the Langford Proxy Trust. Please initiate the liquidation of my shares, coordinate their transfer into my private account ending in 0834, and issue the standard withdrawal of board proxy representation. No notification is required to the company unless required by compliance. Thank you for your discretion. Patricia Langley. I placed it in an envelope, addressed it, and reached for a second sheet. This one felt different. It was for the foundation I had dreamed about since my final active tour. One I never started, always telling myself the time wasn't right. To whom it may concern, I would like to establish a scholarship fund in the name of my late husband, Daniel Langley. The fund will be titled the Langley Memorial Scholarship for Women in Defense Logistics. The initial endowment will be transferred directly from my private account. The fund's mission is to support women veterans and military spouses pursuing degrees or certifications in operations, supply chain, or logistics management, especially those returning from service or re-entering civilian life. Please contact me directly to finalize paperwork. Patricia Langley. My handwriting was steady. When the ink dried, I placed both letters inside a plain document pouch. On a third sheet of paper, I scribbled a note. It wasn't dramatic, just a message I needed him to receive, not for revenge, not even for recognition, but because sometimes silence deserves a final word. Ethan. The return on investment was never meant to be credit. It was supposed to be character. I hope someday you remember that. Mom. I folded it neatly and tucked it inside an envelope. On the front, I wrote in pen, for Ethan Langley. Personal. The next day, after visiting the notary and scanning the letters for record, I drove across town to the ELX Systems building. A receptionist greeted me with a polite, practiced smile. Do you have an appointment, ma'am? No, I said. Just a drop-off. I handed her the envelope without explanation. She took it confused for a moment, then noticed the name on the front. Her eyebrows lifted. I'll make sure it gets to him. I thanked her and walked away. That night I didn't wait for a reply. I didn't check my email. I didn't wonder if he'd call. I sat outside on the back porch with a wool blanket over my lap, sipping tea and watching the wind move through the trees. A few neighborhood lights blinked through the darkness. Somewhere a train horn echoed. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt finished. There's a difference. When someone tells you to stay out of the way, it's because they think your presence is something optional, something peripheral. But the truth is, I had been in the way all along. In the way of lies. In the way of delusion. In the way of a version of the past where I had no place. So I stepped aside, not out of weakness, but because I no longer needed to hold up a structure that didn't want my foundation. Instead, I built something else. Not a legacy for him to use, but a future for others to stand on. That night, for the first time in decades, I slept without clenching my jaw. And in the morning, the sun came through the blinds, soft and quiet and mine. 3 days passed with no sound from Ethan. The silence didn't sting the way it once would have. It felt expected, like waking up and finding fog outside the window. You don't blame the weather for being what it is. You just brew your coffee a little stronger and move through it. Each morning I found myself in the garden just after dawn, my knees nestled into damp soil, pruning shears in one hand, a worn basket at my side. I deadheaded roses, trimmed back the rosemary, coaxed basil into fuller shape. It's funny how your hands remember things even when your heart forgets. I didn't think about the gala, not deliberately, but every now and then an image flickered back, the flash of the camera. Jonathan's voice saying, "Colonel Langley," the way Ethan's eyes dropped to his shoes when I didn't return his smile. But mostly, I thought about nothing, and that was the gift. On the fourth morning, the call came. I didn't hear the phone ring. I found the voicemail when I came inside, muddy gloves tossed beside the sink kettle warming on the stove. The message was short. His voice wasn't angry. It was tight, strained, wound like a rope pulled taut across too many excuses. "Hi, Mom. I guess I'm supposed to say thanks, but I'm honestly not sure what you're trying to prove. You embarrassed me. You made people talk. I've got clients asking questions, and Lauren's dad saw the write-up in the business journal. You've gone too far." He didn't say goodbye. Just a breath, then the beep. I stood there a moment, the kitchen clock ticking steadily behind me. I hit delete. Not in anger, not with drama, just the quiet clarity of a woman who no longer collects words that don't mean anything. Later that day, I walked out to the mailbox. Among the usual bills and coupon flyers was a padded envelope with my attorney's return address. Inside, neatly bound, was confirmation of the trust transfer. The fund had been approved. Filed. Active. Attached was a second envelope. Smaller, handwritten. I opened it slowly. "Dear Ms. Langley, I'm writing to thank you. Though those words feel too small, I just found out I'm the first recipient of the Langley Scholarship. I served 2 tours and thought I'd aged out of the system, especially after the VA delays and everything with my discharge. I'm studying supply chain management now. Your fund is covering my books and my first full semester. I don't know who your husband was, but if he was anything like you, I hope I make you both proud. Clara M. P.S. I Googled you. You're kind of a badass." I laughed, soft surprised. Then, without realizing it, I sat down on the hallway bench and let the paper rest on my knees. There it was. Proof of something I hadn't even dared to want, that what I did mattered. Not because it was loud, not because it was visible, but because someone out there was building something with the stone I'd quietly placed beneath their feet. I leaned back, eyes closed, and let the weight shift inside me. For so many years I had made room. For his schedule. For his silence. For the versions of me he preferred. I'd waited for calls, for credit, for any small gesture that might say, "You mattered to me even if I never said it." And suddenly I didn't need that anymore. The weight wasn't mine to carry. I got up, folded the letter carefully, and placed it beside the other important things I kept. Not medals, not plaques, but notes like this. Reminders that the life I lived wasn't invisible just because someone close to me refused to see it. That night I lit a candle. Not for ceremony, but for comfort. I made dinner just for myself, roasted carrots, herbed chicken, a glass of wine. No distractions, no TV, no scrolling. And as I washed the dishes under the warm water, I realized something simple and staggering. I wasn't waiting anymore. Not for Ethan to call. Not for him to understand. Not for the kind of love that shows up late wearing guilt instead of grace. I was his mother. I will always be. But I no longer needed to perform that role in the way he expected. Silent, compliant, erased. That version of me, she'd retired too. It was a Thursday afternoon when the doorbell rang. I wasn't expecting anyone. The mail had already come and I hadn't ordered anything. Most people who knew me well didn't bother with surprise visits. They knew better. And those who didn't, well, they hadn't tried in years. I wiped my hands on a dish towel and made my way to the front door. Through the glass, I saw a sleek sedan parked slightly crooked in the gravel, and a tall figure standing on the porch in a beige coat and low heels. "Lauren!" I opened the door slowly, not out of hesitation, but because something in her posture told me this wasn't a social call. She looked different without the gala makeup. Tired, maybe, lighter in the face but heavier in the shoulders. "Hi," she said. I didn't reply immediately, just waited. "I know this is strange," she continued, "but could we talk?" Just for a minute I stepped aside. "Come in." She entered quietly, her heels clicking on the hardwood like someone trying not to wake a sleeping house. She looked around. Not nosy, more like unsure where to stand. I motioned toward the kitchen. "Would you like some tea?" She nodded. "Yes, please." I filled the kettle and placed it on the burner, the hiss of water breaking the quiet. She sat at the kitchen table, smoothing the sleeve of her coat over and over like it gave her something to hold on to. "I didn't come here on Ethan's behalf," she said suddenly. "I didn't think you did." She blinked at that. Maybe she expected me to ask why she was here. Maybe she expected coldness. But I wasn't offering either. "He doesn't know I'm here," she added. "We haven't really talked much since the gala. Not about that night, anyway." I nodded once and opened the cabinet. Chamomile or Earl Grey chamomile? When the water boiled, I poured 2 cups and set one gently in front of her. She wrapped her fingers around it like it was the first warm thing she'd touched all day. "I didn't know," she said quietly. "Didn't know who you were, what you did. That you were not what he always made you sound like." I didn't answer. She didn't need me to. She exhaled slowly. I think I just believed him. "When he said you were distant, complicated, that you'd chosen a job over a family, that you didn't want to be part of things, it wasn't malicious. It was just the way he framed everything. And you never asked." She shook her head. "I didn't think to. I guess I didn't want to poke at things." We sat in silence for a moment. Outside, the wind moved through the trees. Inside, the clock ticked gently above the stove. "He's having a hard time," Lauren admitted. "Some of the investors pulled back. Jonathan Rice stopped returning his calls. There's been tension in the office. A lot of people talking behind closed doors." "I'm not surprised," I said calmly. "He feels humiliated." I took a slow sip of tea. Consequences tend to feel like that. Lauren winced. "I'm not here to defend him. Honestly, I don't know how to feel. But I wanted to see you. I wanted to, I don't know, understand for myself." She looked around the kitchen again. Her eyes landed on a small photo near the windowsill. Me in uniform, one arm around a young woman in fatigues, both of us grinning with dirt on our faces. "That's Clara," I said, "the first recipient of the fund. She wrote you a letter." I nodded. "A good one." "I read about the fund," Lauren said softly. "The way you named it after your husband. I didn't even know you were married before. Or widowed. There's a lot you didn't know." She set the cup down gently. "That's why I came. Not to apologize. Not really. But to witness something with her own eyes. I didn't tell her what to think. I didn't explain the deployments or the missed birthdays or the silence that stretched across years like a canyon no one wanted to cross. I just let her sit in the same space as the truth. Eventually she stood. "I should go," she said, "but thank you for letting me come." I walked her to the door. She paused on the threshold, then turned to look at me. "You deserved better," she said. "From both of us." I didn't nod. I didn't agree. I didn't offer forgiveness or a closing statement. I just held her gaze until she looked away. Then she walked to her car, started the engine, and disappeared down the drive. And for the first time, I didn't feel invisible. Not because someone had changed their mind about me, but because I no longer needed them to. The last week of October settled in like an old friend. Quiet, unobtrusive, soft around the edges. The trees in my backyard had begun to shed in earnest gold and auburn, blanketing the earth like a quilt no one asked for but everyone needed. Morning light filtered through the kitchen in warm ribbons stretching across the tile floor and onto my slippers as I brewed my tea. There was a stillness in the house that wasn't loneliness. It was clarity, the kind that follows a long storm when the air smells of wet bark and second chances. For the first time in years, I wasn't waiting for a knock at the door or a text I had to read twice to decode between the lines affection. My days moved at my pace. My space was mine. Each morning after tending to the roses, still stubborn in bloom, I'd walk to the mailbox, bills a flyer for gutter cleaning, the occasional catalog I never ordered, and sometimes something else, a message from the scholarship committee, an email printed out from a veteran named Shayla, or Monique, or Aratelli. Each one different, but all of them carried the same line somewhere in the body of the letter. I didn't know anyone was still thinking about women like us. Some wrote from tiny apartments, some from community college dorms, one even from a halfway house. Some were mothers, some were grieving, some were just tired. But they all wrote with a kind of honesty I hadn't seen in years. No polish, no performance. I wrote back to each one, not formally, just like one woman to another. You're not alone. You matter. Keep going. I didn't use a letterhead. I didn't need a title. They already knew. One afternoon, I spent hours rearranging the bookshelf in the study, not because it needed doing, but because I wanted to touch each spine. I ran my fingers over field manuals, family cookbooks, a slim poetry collection I'd carried through deployments without ever finishing. In the back corner beneath a stack of folders, I found the shadow box again. Inside it was my commissioning photo, smudged at the corner from where Ethan once held it with sticky fingers as a child asking if I'd ever been a boss like a general. There were medals, yes, and commendations, but I didn't care much for the shine. I cared about what they had cost. That evening after dinner, just soup and toast, I brought the shadow box to the living room. I dusted the mantel, moved the vase of dried lavender, and gently set the photo of myself in uniform beside Daniel's portrait. He in his dress blues, me in mine. 20 years we'd been apart, but now somehow we were side by side again. And for once I didn't feel like I was tucking myself into his memory. I was placing myself where I belonged. Later that night, as the wind picked up and the trees rustled like whispers just outside the window, I curled up under a wool throw on the couch. The fireplace crackled gently, not for warmth, but for presence. I cradled a book I'd tried to read before but never had the bandwidth for, a memoir by a military spouse who found her own voice after decades of silence. I read a chapter and set it down. That's when I noticed the small padded envelope on the side table. I must have brought it in with the rest of the mail and forgotten. The handwriting on the front was familiar. Clara. I opened it carefully, unfolding the single sheet inside. Dear Ma'am, first quiz was brutal, but I passed. Professor said my outline was one of the strongest in class, and I didn't tell him it came from one of your old reports that I found online. I sit near the back, still adjusting. Some days I feel like I'm 30, sitting next to kids who still live off granola bars and Red Bull. But you gave me something. Permission, maybe. To be older and still starting. I wore my veteran pin to class today. No one asked about it, but I didn't care. I'm not invisible anymore. Hope you're doing something for yourself this week. You lit a path I didn't know was allowed to exist. Clara P. S. When I graduate, I'm mailing you a picture of me with the diploma. Just wait. I sat there for a long time, the letter resting in my lap like a warm stone. I reread it twice. The words weren't poetic, but they held something more rare truth without apology. I reached for my keepsake box. An old cedar one Daniel gave me when we were stationed in Germany, back when we used to write letters even though we saw each other every day. Inside were a few mementos I had kept close. Clara's first letter, a program from my retirement ceremony, and a photo of Ethan when he was 7 holding a soccer trophy, half his size, grinning with both front teeth missing. I added Clara's second letter, smoothing its folds with the back of my hand. Then I closed the box, not as a goodbye, but as a pause. I didn't expect a call from Ethan. I didn't replay old arguments or rehearse possible futures. I didn't scroll his company's website or check his LinkedIn or try to guess whether he even still had my letter on his desk. The old me might have, but she had stepped off duty. I hadn't built the fund for applause. I hadn't walked out of that gala to be dramatic. I hadn't removed my equity to make a point. I did it all because for the first time in decades, I remembered I could make decisions that honored who I was, not just who I was expected to be. I didn't need to be the kind of mother that makes herself small so her children can pretend to be giants. I didn't need to earn a place I had already paid for in years of silence. I didn't need to answer calls that only came when someone felt embarrassed. I looked out the window. The moon was full, casting soft light across the lawn. The trees swayed gently as if nodding in time with my breath. I sat in that stillness, not craving movement or meaning, just presence. I am Patricia Langley. Colonel, yes. Wife once, mother always, but most importantly, whole. And I am home. Have you ever felt like you were being erased from your own life? Like no matter how much you gave, your presence was only welcome when it was quiet, convenient. If this story touched something in you, a memory, a wound, or just that quiet ache of being unrecognized, take a moment to share your thoughts in the comments. Your voice matters, more than you know. And if you believe in the power of stories that honor quiet strength and dignity, don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell. We have more stories like this, of women who were overlooked, underestimated, and who found their way back to themselves. We'll see you in the next one.